Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for being with us. I hope you're having a fantastic day at the Retail Media Summit. I'm Kieran Howells. I am from Retail Gazette, and I have the pleasure of being joined by Lee Dunbar. Maybe Lee, to kick us off, you wouldn't mind just telling us a bit about your history in the space of retail media and about yourself.
Yeah, I've been at Starcom and in retail media in one form or another for the last 15 plus years. Started off in Black Friday, Cyber Monday campaign that one of our clients had, and they were like, "What about this Amazon thing?" And that's what started me off on the journey that is retail media. So it's been fun and obviously has heated up for the last 5 years.
Yeah, and it's obviously kept you interested and engaged because you're still here
Yes,
15 years later. So
certainly.
an incredibly long time in a super evolving space, exactly as you said. So I'm wondering, what are some of the key milestones along that journey that have really excited you, as you've seen that progression happen?
I think when we started to get more self-service capabilities outside of Amazon on site, that was pretty powerful. I remember one joke I have with my team is I'm old enough to remember when we did bids in Excel sheets for one
Mhm.
of our retail partners. And then suddenly now they have a platform where you can do all that, and obviously there's APIs, and that's probably one of the key milestones I think. It was just before the pandemic, one of those partners transition to a better tool. And that was also maybe shortly after, I think the following year is when Trade Desk had their announcement with Walmart. And that was another sort of like switch gear where, oh, we're going to finally access Walmart audiences in a self-service capacity. And that, again, sea change where it was going to be self-service. It's not this sort of managed service. They're an old school network. It's more, okay, this is a data layer we can add. And I think we're still kind of unpacking what we do with that. But I think that was a major milestone, at least for me, in just how exciting it could potentially get.
Fantastic, fantastic. And we're at an interesting kind of period for retail media. So when I was thinking about this conversation, I was thinking everyone in this audience will wish that they had invested in Apple stock 20 years ago. Everyone will wish that they'd bought a few Bitcoin when they were, what, 20 quid ago or something like that, and not spent them all on a pizza.
Right.
And so these are things that we wish we'd got in on the ground floor of. And there is ostensibly a really huge growth trajectory for retail media that we are currently on. No way are we near the top of this. As you say, there are still fundamentals that are being figured out. So, as someone with so much experience in this space, I would love to know, how can our audience have a kind of Apple stock or Bitcoin ground floor moment today with retail media?
I think the Apple stock moment, I got in on something early, is kind of the weird, maybe boring stuff. I used to say that actually about my job when they were like, "Oh, well, what do you do?" I'm like, "Well, about half my job, nobody actually did this full time, I don't think, for, for a long period of time, is I handle some of those retail buys for the client, and I was started to become that retail guy, and so especially those earlier in their career, if there is something that's like, well, maybe there's not a lot of attention on this particular retail platform or this particular tactic, it is wild how quickly there can be so much energy and focus on it
Mhm.
uh, overnight. And I think that's the thing that really is a trademark of all retail media. They said this about podcasting, but it felt like it was an overnight sensation 10 years in the making. And
Mm,
that's exactly what retail media was.
yeah.
And so, yeah, it can be obvious. Oh, let me go to Amazon or Walmart. But I think look for those other uh, partners that maybe they're 1% of the total marketplace, but they have something really interesting that tech could get parroted by others.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because you do think if we're going to make a really big impact with retail media, perhaps the goal is to go with whoever has the largest market share, but that's not really how the nuances of retail media work, is it? I mean, as you say, actually, you may find something really agile that suits you way more when looking at the 1% of the market rather than the the big names right at the
Right.
top there.
And there's a graveyard of ideas there. Don't get me wrong. When I was, assisting with some social programs for our clients, I remember getting excited for Google Wave, and I was like, oh, this is going to change everything, and that dates me completely. And I love saying that because it's like Betamax versus VHS. I enjoy the journey of looking at that and
Mhm.
then applying it later. Or, Instacart when they launched Fizz, I was like, this is so powerful. This is a great concept. But even then, a few months ago. And again, I still hold some hope that it'll get a lot of wave of interest and engagement. That concept of collective buying being brought to markets that don't necessarily have it, oh, that's something powerful. That's going to be something big someday. It may not be in that platform, but it might, be something that gets built on by some other folks.
And of course, one of the maybe the biggest challenges in the room for the people watching this is gaining internal advocacy for investment. So there
Yeah,
are a million great ideas out there, and I think retail media is obviously a huge fundamental one. However, for those who aren't in the know, you know, in a time when budgets are tight and tightening, um, how do you make that play? What does a successful pitch have to feature?
those discussions we've had where it's like get in on early on this is not just innovation for innovation's sake. Oftentimes, we're attaching that to first mover advantage, or there's less competitors in this environment. Your CPC, and if we're talking about sponsored ads, may actually be a lot lower. You won't scale as much. But if you're trying to find where your next dollar goes, why not go early in the growth curve of a partner and get that market share maybe that's outsized versus your market share on some other common platforms. Now that still uh, is difficult in a world of finite dollars, but it does stretch that dollar a little bit further. At least that's how we try to frame it. I'm not going to say I'm successful in doing that all the time, but I do think it's sort of, hey, diversify your portfolio, that sort of thinking. We talk about fragmentation being a challenge and almost a curse of retail media, but I think it's the most exciting part of it because we're allowed to find, maybe those investments that other folks haven't seen and don't have an understanding of. And that's an advantage. That's a competitive advantage we can offer a client.
Yeah, but if I was, say, I'm sitting around my boardroom table, and maybe with some people who aren't even in the know about what's happening in retail media,
Sure.
how are you kind of pitching the idea to them? Because I think that
Mm.
that's a really interesting approach, the idea that actually you can search for hidden wins that maybe others aren't visualizing yet.
Yeah,
But first, you've got to get that fundamental sell in.
sure, sure. I position it as, with a partner like Amazon, let's say I'm a coffee brand, I might have 40 competitors in a given week, and it might even be more than that. But if I'm a first mover on maybe a smaller delivery platform or a new tech that's integrated in a variety of retailers, maybe I have three, maybe I have four. Maybe I'm actually have more of an opportunity to get that share of mind or to be able to, get that conversion for a lot lower than maybe I would have on an Amazon. And I pick on Amazon just because that's the stable environment where, there's the robust third party marketplace. And so you're always going to have a ton of competitors.
Mhm.
This is the area where it's like, all right, if I'm getting waylaid and beaten with so many different folks to spend against, this other platform may be sort of a hidden refuge for me to grow my brand. But I mean, it's difficult, especially in a more senior level with clients, to say, I want you to take a bet and place a bet here.
Mhm.
And we can't guarantee that. And I think retail media, because of the sales response, can often seem like this is a guaranteed dollar. This dollar will get me $3 in ROAS. We can talk about incrementality later if we want, but
Mhm.
that's that sort of belief that we've been fueled by. And on another partner, maybe the attribution's a little down. Maybe they actually don't deliver, some of the same volume now. And so you still struggle against that of like, well, I get three, even if it is difficult to compete on this platform. I don't even get it, or it's $1.50.
Mhm.
And that's it all boils down to, can you get them to think long term? And that's a very difficult proposition in a world of quarterly, earnings calls and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And from a retailer perspective, because a lot of people in the room today will be coming at this from a retailer perspective as well. Um, in you mentioned kind of the the comparison to podcasts. I think that's a really interesting one because
Sure.
everyone and their dog has a podcast these days. um, but actually, we're still seeing, and at Retail Gazette, we're constantly reporting on. Actually, this new company, this company is now adopting retail media in their stores or online. The evolution is happening very quickly, but still there's a lot to be done, and there's a lot of companies who could be taking advantage of actually being a great platform for retail media. Where do you start there? Because it's that evolution is happening fast. It's almost like trying to listen to a band with a giant back catalogue already,
Sure.
finding how to get into it.
Yeah, yeah. How do I start something new in a world where there's so many different competitors?
Yeah.
Um, it is. I think there's a second mover advantage. I think that maybe retailers have of, all right, I've seen where this model doesn't work. Let me try this model. Let me try this model. And in fact, we've seen that with some of the later entries to say, I'm going to have about 5 or 6 ways you can monetize my audience. You can use my audience for your benefit. Before, and I think this is still true for a lot of our legacy partners that do get the majority of the retail media dollars, there's only like 1 or 2 ways. And so being able to make it easy to integrate, to say, I'm going to just add this to my DV360 campaign, or I'm going to add this to my Yahoo campaign, that becomes an easier sell-in that may be outsized versus, hey, they're not a well-known partner, but heck, I can just throw them in and they have a really interesting audience that is complementary to maybe my base audience. And that's kind of what I've pushed is, can you just make it dead simple for a programmatic trader who has no idea who a merchant is,
Yeah.
couldn't point them out in a lineup, but at least knows, hey, that's an interesting audience that tells me something. I think the other aspect I've seen is telling better stories with their audience. So, Amazon and Walmart, they can say, we're Amazon and Walmart. Find our shoppers. There's millions of them. And we're the only way to get to them. That's a powerful story. A Dollar General tells a different story to say, we have rural, low income audience shoppers. They're very easy to find with our data. They're very difficult to find with anybody else.
Mm.
And so they start to tell not just a story about, hey, these are shoppers that are maybe interesting to you. They're actually incremental from a reach perspective. Maybe they can finally find that extra 10% of reach that you need against adults 25 to 54,
Yeah.
because this is an untapped audience. So I think those sort of 2 ways make it easy, and then really just tell your story in a dead simple way to say, oh, that's an interesting audience that's outside, over and above just being from my retail sales.
Yeah. And do you think that that's the way that the market is heading? I mean, as I've put in my notes and we talked about previously, in this day and age, I think with anything, it's impossible to future gaze 5 years down the
Sure.
line. We have no idea what 5 years is
No.
going to look like. But for the kind of mid future, do you think instead of the early adopters and the big players in the market across the world kind of eating up more and more of that spend, that actually finding those niches and embracing those and pulling apart actually what the audience that you have is going to be the way forwards?
I think the idea of like this sort of retail data marketplace, and I think that's certainly what Trade Desk has tried to sell itself as,
Mhm.
is the future we want, of being able to say, okay, I'm going to look at the 20 or 50 audiences and say, all right, I like this one, I like this one, this adds some incrementality, this is great. Being able to have that kind of bazaar of different things I can pick from is powerful for a media buyer. I think
Mhm.
for a retailer, there's a sense that this could be a race to the bottom.
Mm.
And we're already starting to see that, right? Like the prices that even Walmart used to command for its audiences have gone down some. And that's can be a little bit of a scary prospect to say, are we going to do what we did to Datalogics and some other folks over the last decade, where we are all sort of expecting sub dollar, maybe even sub 50 cent, data costs. And so that's one area where I think it's a great future to think of all these different signals. What I don't want to have happen is I want the prices to come down. I'm a media buyer, of course I want that, but but I want it to be sustainable where I still can get that same. They still want to participate. Otherwise, they're going to take their toys and go home.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, it would be very interesting to see what happens there. And
So,
I've heard you say some very interesting things about the future of retail media, actually. One of which is it's not just going to become this all-enveloping, the absolute future of retail marketing. Um, Perhaps you could kind of elaborate on that a bit, and maybe what you think some people are fundamentally still getting wrong about the concept.
I think what I consider it as is retail media as is a morphing into a layer across all these different channels. And Kara Pratt with Kroger, when she was there, powerfully told that story. It's a channel and it's a layer. And I think that's absolutely the future we're going to. Now, what that means to me, and this is where I think I have a divergence of opinion sometimes,
Mhm.
is for on-site, it's definitely a channel. For all the sponsored ads, for everything that's going on within the platform and near the platform, inclusive of the retail locations, that's a very obvious ownable channel. And it needs to be thought of as a channel with distinct behaviors and distinct buying styles. Once it starts to become a layer, that's where, and separated from inventory,
Mhm.
that's where, we need to start thinking of it as, okay, this is part of a data strategy. This is part of my programmatic strategy and not so format focused. And what I mean by that is there's such an obsession with CTV as this future for retail media. And I think it's part of the future of CTV. It's certainly going to be an audience layer. But I think we are fooling ourselves a little bit when we think CTV is going to be this big engine of growth across all the retailers. Outside of Amazon, Amazon's its own thing. It
Mhm.
sells more in advertising than it does in toys, than it does in food. It's an advertiser in some cases that happens to sell things.
Right.
Now that's not the case for some of these other retailers where, okay, it is something that they need to own, and they're not going to be in a world where they're buying TV networks or movie studios.
Mhm.
Walmart was interesting in their purchase of Vizio to try to get it from the inventory layer, and I think they've started to do that. But I don't think they're going to be in a world, and I'm going to eat my words tomorrow if they bought Yahoo. I don't think they're going to go out and buy a DSP and do that. Um, hey, cool if that happened, but I also think I think not every retailer can do that. So now I think it's not necessarily a world where I can buy Disney via Kroger. It's more I can use that Kroger audience on Disney, or I can use that audience from Instacart in this TV buy that I might be wanting to do from an addressable perspective. I can use that data in all sorts of powerful ways, but tying it to the inventory of CTV, we're kind of I think it's very tough to pitch that, and I think it's one way to make it easier to buy, but not necessarily something that is going to be the engine of growth here. I mean, we're sitting here 3 years after the first CTV programs outside of Amazon, really, maybe a little bit longer. We're still at 70% in the US being sponsored ads.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we can't get over that sort of large percentage that's still on site. And even Amazon themselves can't. It's as much as they're really making strides in their DSP.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear you say that. So, and talking of Amazon, I know that that is a company that you have a history at, including on top of the likes of Walmart, Instacart, Kroger, and Target, and many more. What's some of the biggest differences you've noticed in how each approaches retail media? And also, are there some core fundamentals that they're all sticking to, or is it all nuanced to who they are, their
Mm.
identity?
I mean, I think they would want me to say they're all nuanced and different from each other,
Yeah.
and I think there are some fundamental differences, right? Some core beliefs. Costco, huge club retailer in the U.S., um, very much is about member value. How can they deliver that? Walmart is always going to be everyday low price. Sam Walton built that around that concept. What does that mean? Maybe not necessarily promotional things or loyalty apps or things like that. They've sort of flirted with Walmart Plus, kind of overcoming some of that.
Mhm.
So there's some fundamentals and character differences. But I do think there's for the core traditional retailers that have a retail media business, the merchant is this powerful figure within the set of stakeholders. The merchant being the one really determining how that physical and online shelf is going to look. And they can futz with the algorithms to make sure it's delivering in a way that's going to get the most sales out of the shoppers that they're wanting to connect with. So where there's a merchant, that's where I think there's still this. Well, there's going to be this back and forth in store and online where we may not, as an advertiser, maybe I want to have placements on every shelf. I want to have an ad that is on the grocery cart. I just want it all. But the merchant has struggled over the last 50 years with the concept of clean store, and they almost go through cycles of tags on every shelf, and it looks just crazy. To let's really clean this up. No more floor stickers. Like let's really make this a very curated experience. Every merchant's going to have that sort of new character that they want to add to the retailer. Target being one of those, where I think they've really been a powerful merchant-driven organization that prides themselves on how they tell a story in store.
Mhm.
And so I think that's an interesting. You take that and you combine that with in-store advertising. Oof, I'm very interested to see how that's going to evolve. They're going to want to
Yeah.
do that, but it's not quite to the level of maybe an Amazon where it's like they're advertiser led. So when you go into a fresh store, it's like going to the World's Fair where it's
Yeah.
like, oh, there's screens and it's really interesting and it's powerful. They're not gonna they don't have sort of the history to contend with from a merchant perspective.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Interesting, interesting stuff. So, I mean, we also have to acknowledge the fact that actually, of all of the guests that we have along with us today, you are the only one giving us that super vital agency perspective. Um, Really interesting because it's a different view of this market than probably anyone else has. So, I would love it if you could tell us maybe some of the things that you've kind of your core fundamentals from that side, that maybe just could be really enlightening to our audience.
so for an agency, I mean, the core fundamental that we need to operate by is how can I get the most out of my client's dollar in a given channel,
Mhm.
and I am their agent. And I kind of root back on that of like you got to have marketplace understanding and you've got to be just relentless about delivering the value. That was served really well in the world of cable and other fragmented channels, 20 years ago, where we were bulldogs. And I think there's still some folks that I work with that were from that era that they're on the phone constantly and they are pressing as much as they can to try to get that value. When you switch gears to a retail world, it feels a little like, well, there's the joke that who's going to buy lunch? I think somebody at McKinsey did that. And I thought it was a funny story just because on the agency side, we're used to, no, you're going to buy me lunch because we're trying to figure this out. And the idea that I would buy them lunch is just like, if I said that to any agency person outside of retail, they'd be like, what are you talking about? Why would I even do that? That's bizarre. I'm like, well, you don't understand that this partner is such a core part of your client's business that if they disappear tomorrow, your client would probably have to ditch you and really reduce and figure out how the heck they were going to make their numbers.
Mhm.
So it is a shift into a much more two-way conversation where how can I benefit you? How can you benefit me? And that impacts everything from commercials, when you're going to pay me, to what capabilities are we gonna latch on to, which first looks will we have. I think it's interesting to have a more co-equal relationship with retailers for an agency. I think there's just still some growing pains agencies and folks going into the practices that agencies have to go through to understand, like, no, they get to push back a little bit more. Now, I think retailers have started to understand, oh, that agency gets to push back a little bit because they're trying to get as much value for their client. This isn't just us being jerks. We're trying to get as much efficiency as we can.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'm really, really sorry to say that we're pretty much out of time, but I'm going to be cheeky and squeeze in one more question if you don't mind.
Love it.
Um, as mentioned earlier, we cannot future gaze too far. It's just not realistic or feasible. But I would love to know if there's anything that you see coming down the road in the short to mid term that just really excites you and engages you, and that we probably should be looking out for.
I think the change that has happened quite rapidly in terms of how people make purchases in the store is something that attaches even more signals that we can advertise against. One of the big, you talked about sea change moments. I think it was last year when I saw Sam's Club showed someone doing self checkout with their phone, mobile checkout, and scanning a spinach and then getting that ad for salad dressing.
Hmm.
It's such a small thing, but it's such a powerful like moment where, okay, that's somewhere as an advertiser I want to be.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, as we start to talk about the digitization of the stores, that's where I think we're gonna find even more powerful moments like that. So I think it's less about big screens in the freezer section that may arrest attention, and that's really interesting. I think it's more about those little moments when I'm checking out or when I'm going throughout the store. We talk about that on the carts. I think that's an interesting area where I don't think we can. I think we'll find it much more fundamental like that, where it's like just a little moment, a little nudge about something versus the bigger advertising moments that are explosive. I would love some of those, but I
Hmm.
think there needs to be a focus on that just because I think the data there is really powerful. Now,
Yeah.
long term, all right, so that's kind of my midterm. Like, let's look
Yeah.
at that. Long term, I think agentic retail is something that um, is a powerful sledgehammer on the whole sponsored ads model. That's 70% of the retail media world, right? The idea of having an agent shop for you and make those purchases, I think that's an area that, all right, am I going to advertise to bots now? Am I going to try to integrate with the bot? And we talked about this where there may be categories where maybe it's sort of bot assisted. They're my co-pilot. I would rather have a bot do all my grocery shopping.
Hmm.
But when it comes to toys, I probably want to have a hand in that. I want to have some understanding as a father, like, all right, well, what do they want? What does it say about our relationship? So there's a little bit more involvement, right? I'm not going to have a bot buying my wife's gift, right? I have to have a hand in that. And
Yeah.
so I think there's certain high consideration moments where it's like, all right, we're all going to have to wrestle with it. I think as consumers, as shoppers, we're going to have to wrestle with it. But agentic retail, I think we will always find some way to have advertising surround that or be part of that. But that is a shift from the much more simplistic, by comparison, sponsored ads model of just, all right, let me show up in 3 out of the 5 placements at the top of the search bar.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we will have to wrap it up there because that is such an interesting topic, that I think we could go on for a few more hours just delving into agentic by itself. But thank you so much for your time, Lee. It has been such a pleasure to hear all of your insight. And to our audience, thanks for watching along. I'm sure this has been just as engaging for you as it has for me. Enjoy the rest of your day, and Lee, hopefully we'll see you again very soon.
Absolutely. Appreciate it, guys. Thank you.